Breaking news tonight. Bone-chilling Bryan Kohberger details emerge. Good evening. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Crime Stories. Thank you for being with us.
Bombshell, a new tell-all book, reveals a bone-chilling theory on Idaho murder suspect Bryan Kohberger. Author Howard Blum joins Crime Stories for an exclusive interview.
Howard Blum is joining us right now from Manhattan, along with an all-star panel to dissect what we know and what we are learning from Howard Blum. You know, I have pored over every document, every search warrant, every return, every witness statement that I could get my mitts on. I have flown to Idaho, to Moscow, Idaho, in the midst of winter and trudged through the snow to look at the scene as best as I could, to drive the route. I believe, oh yeah, good times, freezing. Then got in an SUV at night in the pitch dark. At the time, I believe, Bryan Kohberger left that crime scene and started his circuitous route, although an hour's drive to his apartment at nearby Washington State University in Pullman, which should have been about an 8-minute drive. And somewhere along the way, he turns his cell phone back on. That said, after all that, I still learned so much from reading Howard Blum's book. The name, When the Night Comes Falling, a Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders. Wow. Even the title made me stop. And in the midst of everything we all do in regular life, you know, working, your children, your cat, your dog, your mom, I managed to finish this book in one day. I practically could not put it down. I had it in 2 forms. I printed out what I had and had it on my iPad so I could look at it no matter where I was. Howard Blum, it's amazing. You had me sitting in the Costco parking lot in the heat, reading your book, trying to get to the next chapter before I came back home. It's amazing.
Well, I appreciate that. That's very kind. You sit in a room as an author, and you wonder if anyone will read what you write, and then to hear someone talk about it so graciously, I'm very flattered. So thank you.
Well, I've never been accused of being kind before, so I will take that with a box of salt. I want to get right to it. There's so much in your book. I had to take copious notes. So I'll just start at the beginning. It was an amazing intro, and I was struck by the fact that you start your book from Kohberger's father's point of view. And what I learned about his father really touched my heart. How he never got to go to college, and he was so proud of Bryan Kohberger and was already referring to him as Dr. Kohberger amongst his coworkers. And it reminded me so much, Howard, of my father, how he didn't get, we're first generation college. And when I got through law school, in his mind, it was the most amazing thing ever. So proud. Right? Now, here's my question with that lead up. Almost at the beginning, his father and his family, Kohberger's family, suspected him of being the killer. And I found that just, I was dumbstruck. Because, you know, when I read about a crime, I don't immediately think, oh, my son did that. In fact, I've never thought that. Tell me your thinking and why you say that.
Michael Kohberger makes this trip out to see his son to make the ride back with him. You know, this is a 28-year-old man, and his father is worried about him. He's making this trip. It's fatiguing, it's expensive, but he's worried about his son. He's sitting next to him in this car, shoulder to shoulder. He knows the police are looking for a white Hyundai. And one of the first things he realizes when he meets his son is that his son's mood is volatile. That's his first sign that Bryan is in a state. He goes out to meet his son in Washington State, and he doesn't know which Bryan he's going to encounter. But that's his first sign, and he begins to see as the moods change and become deeper and more acerbic. He begins to wonder, oh my gosh. He begins to think the unthinkable. He begins to consider that his son could in fact be a murderer. And all this is building in his mind. And he's afraid to go there, as any father would. But he's getting these clues as if he were following footsteps in the snow, and the footsteps are becoming bloodier and bloodier. And he now realizes, could this really be true? And then all of a sudden they're driving along in Indiana, and they see police sirens in the back, and the car has to pull over. And he begins to feel, what is going to happen next?
Wow. Guys, with me, Howard Blum, who has literally written the book. The name of the book, When the Night Comes Falling, a Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders. And I have learned so much, more than we, the public, have learned, more than my sources have told me, by exhaustive research by Howard Blum. You're looking right at him. Howard, you stated that these aren't your words, that you discovered this from what Kohberger's father stated to other people. What did he state about immediately suspecting his son was the killer?
He went out to Idaho, Washington State at the beginning with suspicions. You have to remember that Michael, this is not his first trip out there. He even took his son out on the first trip in August when his son was just registering for school. He had real concerns about his son.
Joining me an all-star panel in addition to this incredible author, Howard Blum. Howard, I noticed that one of the points of contention was about the route. And when I was driving that route from the King Road murder scene back to his apartment in Pullman, I was wondering why he did that, why he drove an hour in the middle of the night. And I'm sure you know there's no street lights. It's pitch black. I nearly ran off the road a couple of times when a semi would come by. But he basically did the same thing with his dad. The dad flies out, does a quick turnaround. He's exhausted. He gets in the launcher with his son. And the son refuses to go the direct and much shorter route. Do you think that had anything to do with Kohberger believing he was being followed or monitored?
I think Kohberger, being a criminology student, was trying to take precautions. At this point, I don't think he had any belief or any knowledge that he was being followed. However, he was trying to be circumspect. He was trying to be one step smarter than the authorities.
Again, in addition to Howard Blum, now preeminent author, an all-star panel. And I want to go out to Chris McDonough joining us, the director of the Cold Case Foundation, former homicide detective, host of The Interview Room on YouTube, who, like me, like Howard, has seen the evidence, has walked the scene, very familiar with the area. Chris McDonough, you've had a lot of homicide cases, and very often family members know their son is a killer, but they will never admit it. And I'm thinking about Kohberger's dad, who knew he had suspicions at the beginning his son was a quadruple killer.
Yeah, and Nancy, I think what happens is, right, that parental, tendency kicks in relationship to, they want to believe it, but they don't necessarily want to believe it, and so it's kind of a tug and pull from a parental position. However, in this particular case, it's obvious Dad had his radar was way up, and had taken that trip to go out and pick up his son. So that in of
Well,
itself tells
think
us
about it,
potential.
Chris. And let me throw this to Dr. Angela Arnold, a renowned psychiatrist joining us, AngelaArnoldMD.com. Have you ever seen parents that tiptoe around their child, that they're just
all the
waiting
time.
for an explosion? And when I was reading the first chapter in Howard's book, When the Night Comes Falling, you could feel the tension of the father in the car with Kohberger on this long drive, just waiting for an explosion. But we got to keep in mind the dad, Michael Kohberger, had spent his whole life trying to prop up, support, help Bryan Kohberger. So he knew it was like walking through a minefield. Anything could make him explode. And when Kohberger insisted on this circuitous route, which took hours and hours longer than a direct route, he went, okay, fine, you're the boss. Those are the words the father used to Kohberger.
Well, sure, because Nancy, the last thing he was going to do was confront this guy, because I have to wonder if the father knew all of this, was the father a little bit terrified of what could set Bryan off? And possibly was the father's life in danger at this point, because apparently Bryan was agitated at this time? I wonder if the circuitous route had anything to do with some sort of OCD kind of disorder that this guy has.
Howard Blum, you also described Bryan Kohberger, his heroin habit, how he got into heroin, and when he managed to kick heroin after his father turned him in for stealing the sister's phone, and he had to go into some sort of a rehab, a treatment to get his life straight. He kicked heroin and decided his body was a temple, and that is when he became a vegetarian. And I had wondered where that started, because now he's demanding certain types of meals behind bars, and he's getting them. And I remember an anecdote where the family couldn't cook with certain pots and pans because they had once cooked meat. I'm working up to it. You reveal that Kohberger had 2 types of plastic surgery after he loses 100 pounds. What were they?
Well, Bryan Kohberger is intent, and this is the admirable part of him. He's trying to reinvent himself. He comes out of this depressing hardscrabble existence, a family with 2 bankruptcies. He's going to a hardscrabble high school. His father is a janitor at the high school. He's sort of embarrassed by that. He becomes a heroin addict, and yet, to his credit, he works himself out of this. He then he's trying to approach girls at high school. They're ignoring him. He loses the weight, and he still has this sort of flesh that's going over his midsection. And it's just not the sort of guy he wants to be. He wants to be a player. He wants to be one of the cool guys. And he thinks, so he has this surgery, these 2 surgeries are covered by insurance, and he reinvents himself. He's in good shape, as you can see in the photographs. He works out, he does martial arts, and he still tries to become the man he wants to be. And yet, at the end,
Plastic surgery.
Yes.
The plastic surgeries.
He has these 2 plastic surgeries to get over his midsection, so there's not this sort of envelope, like the lid on an envelope.
Howard, you're so polite. Okay. You outline it in your book. He had 2 surgeries, one of them being an abdominoplasty, and the other, you know what, they're long. Let me rephrase, Liz. You described 2 plastic surgeries that Bryan Kohberger has. Both of them, I believe, were related to removing flaps of skin left over from the 100-plus pound weight loss, a flap of skin and tissue that went down over his private parts and his lower stomach. He wanted to get rid of that. And when he did get rid of that through plastic surgery, he had a serious buff body, is the way I take it from your book. Is that what happened?
That's exactly what happened. He had this vision that he would become a new Bryan Kohberger. And the tragedy is he almost succeeded. he gets out to Washington State a new man, and he's trying to live a new life, and yet he's pulled back in to what he always is, to his essence, I believe.
Bryan Kohberger allegedly enters the home and walks past the first rooms he sees coming into the Moscow, Idaho house and goes straight up a narrow staircase and turns directly into the room of his target, Madison Mogen. Author Howard Blum says investigators believe Maddie Mogen is the target and her best friend Kaylee Gonzalez is killed because she's in the room with Mogen.
Did Bryan Kohberger's parents suspect their son? An explosive new book suggests family knew more than they ever let on about their troubled son. Author Howard Blum tells us more.
Guys, joining me is the author Howard Blum, author of When the Night Comes Falling, A Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders. Howard Blum has gone where many have not, tediously investigating everything about this case, and the book is full of revelations. We were just describing how Kohberger's own family thought at the get-go, before he was ever named a suspect or even a POI, person of interest, that he committed the quadruple murders. And in this vein, can you imagine Kohberger's father, so proud of his son getting his PhD, flies out to Washington to drive Kohberger back home to the Poconos area for Thanksgiving. And he's sitting there for all these hours in this white Elantra, which of course he knows has been named in the case, and looking over at his son, who is acting more and more volatile. But I want to move on to the next point. Listen.
In a shocking revelation, author Howard Blum claims Bryan Kohberger is not a random spree killer. He had one target in mind the night he allegedly killed 4 college students in their home off campus in Moscow, Idaho. Blum says investigators believe in a non-targeted attack, the killer would have stopped at the first door inside the house. It would have been instinctive to go into the first rooms after gaining entry, but that isn't what happened. Investigators point to the 2 surviving roommates, Dylan Mortenson and Bethany Funke, as proof Kohberger is after a specific target.
You know, you really back your theory up with a lot of facts, and the way they're laid out, it makes perfect sense. But all along, it has been believed, it has been accepted that Kaylee Gonzalez was the target, the original target, and the others were just collateral damage. But you say no. Why?
Well, at this point, Kaylee is not even really living in the house. She's living up north with her family. She's going to graduate at the end of the term in December. And Bryan really wouldn't have come in contact with her necessarily. But he did go to the Mad Greek restaurant, which in downtown Moscow. It served vegan food, which he liked, which he would adhere to strictly, and Maddie was a waitress there. And my belief is that they encountered one another in the restaurant. Were any words said? Did they have a conversation? I don't think that was necessary. You know, both the prosecution and the defense have said for the record that there was no interaction between Bryan Kohberger and any of the victims. But Bryan was a man whose life was sort of determined by obsessions, determined such as being addicted to heroin, such as losing 100 pounds, such as deciding to become the best student after being a mediocre student. And I think once he saw Maddie, for whatever reasons, I mean, she's an attractive blonde woman, charming, vivacious, ebullient, he becomes interested in her. And I think his fixation, he would see the parties, he would be in, I believe, on the periphery of events as parties were hosted at this house on King Road, a party house, and he would look at that and he felt it was in some ways a constant rebuke to the life that he was leading and the life he wanted to live. He could never be a part of that. And he decided in his rage and his mania, I believe, to do something about it. Kaylee is collateral damage. The two other victims are collateral damage too.
Near the beginning of your book, you talk about Bryan Kohberger delving into, quote, the criminal mind, and will be a, quote, scientist exploring why criminals do what they do. It's been kicked around that his motive, not that the state needs to prove a motive, they don't, but juries like to hear it. So practically speaking, you better hand one over on a silver platter on top of the Christmas tree. You can't have him full of rage and methodically trying to carry out the perfect murder and get away with it very calmly and methodically. So, which one is it? What about it, Blum?
He was filled with mania, which is not the same thing as rage. And you're trying to understand, make a rational explanation for completely irrational acts. What Bryan Kohberger tried to do that night is to commit, I believe, the perfect crime. I believe he wanted to get Maddie, he wanted to kill her, and then once he gets into the house, once he finds another girl there, all his plans fall apart. That's why he leaves the knife sheath behind. He did think things out. As the police well know, there wasn't any blood, a trail of blood left by the perpetrator in the house. All they had was the touch DNA on the knife sheath. There was no trail of blood going up the hill or where a car was parked. To this day, they have not found the murder weapon. To this day, they have not found any clothes covered with blood from that house. And the house was filled with blood. We've all seen the pictures of the rivulets of blood leaking out from the foundation of the house. So he did have some planning. He knew enough, he thought, to turn off his phone from 2:47 to 4:48 for those 2 hours when the murders were taking place. And
Hey, Howard Blum. You're the fire hydrant. You're giving me the information faster than I can take it in. I can't drink from a fire hydrant. You've got to give it to me teaspoon by teaspoon. And I'm telling you, this book, amazing. But Brian C. Stewart joining me, high-profile lawyer joining us, who practices in this jurisdiction as well as in Utah. Brian, I hear what Howard is saying. I hear what Joe Scott Morgan is saying. And I've got to agree, I empathize. I get both the theories. The reality is the state never has to prove a motive, but jurors want to hear a motive. So do you believe that when this case goes to trial, which it is, despite the defense dragging their feet and dragging the judge along with them, he's going along with it, do you believe the state has to pick a theory as to motive? Because these two were not consistent. Or are they? Rage versus method.
Well, motive can be an important part of the circumstantial evidence that leads a jury to understand why a perpetrator commits a crime. But as you said, it's not necessary to prove that they committed the crime. Here, where Bryan Kohberger seems like somebody who's studying criminal justice and perhaps sees himself as the smartest person in the room or a narcissist, his motivation may be to commit the perfect crime, and he would know that choosing someone in another city who he doesn't have a relationship with would create a lot of distance between him and the potential victim. That's the first thing that police look for, is relationships in a murder. And he might have chosen Maddie as someone who's young and blonde and beautiful and might get him a lot of notoriety as he evades justice. And so if that's his motivation, that could certainly be the reason why he chose somebody and doesn't have necessarily rage for Maddie, but has rage for the system, or mania, as Harold says, to beat the system.
Joining us, Howard Blum, who has meticulously investigated so many facts of the case that we didn't know about, including Kohberger's past, how he lost 100 pounds and had 2 different plastic surgeries to remove a flap of skin from his stomach that went down over his genitals. He didn't want that look. He lost 100 pounds on his own, had 2 plastic surgeries to reinvent himself as a modern-day Adonis. But, according to his friends, what I'm reading in When the Night Comes Falling, his friends didn't like how that transformation changed his personality. He became a know-it-all, very aggressive, and that was borne out at Washington State University. He treated his friends in high school that way after he got his new look. He became, in his mind, the it guy, but somehow he couldn't pull it off. What, if anything, did that have to do with the murders of 4 beautiful University of Idaho students? Okay, to this whole panel, including Howard Blum joining us, I've got to have more than what Joe Scott Morgan is telling me, that the attack on Kelly was much more savage than the attack on Maddie Mogen. Why? All 4 of them were brutally stabbed dead. I need to know who is my target. And in this book, Blum describes a blood trail. He also describes the blood literally leaking down the outside of the house, which I observed when I went to Idaho. But that's it. Let's talk about the blood evidence, Howard Blum. What about the blood evidence convinces you as to who the real target was?
Well, one point that you've just made about the wounds on Kaylee being so severe. Kaylee fought back. She was originally in the bed with Maddie. She gets up from the bed. The room is very narrow. She tries to get towards the wall, but she's trapped by Kohberger, and she's fighting back, and she is not dying easily. It's a very violent death, and he's enraged that he even has to, I believe, that he had to encounter her. He did not expect her. And to then find this woman fighting back like a tiger is putting him in his mania, is exacerbating the situation. He thought he would go in there and kill Maddie, her presence rebuked him. I think that's what was going on that night in that house.
Nancy?
I'm trying to take it in. Yeah, jump in.
So there's a couple of things, from my thought process in this. One is, that evening, Kohberger, I don't think he's manic depressive or in a manic state in any way, shape, or form. My personal opinion. I think he's very organized. He selected his target set on purpose. And the reason I feel that way, there's a couple things. One is both Madison and Kaylee, they're attached at the hip. And that evening, when Kohberger pulls up, if he's our guy, he's got to see her car. He's got to know, based on the surveillance that he's been doing, that she potentially could be there as well. And so we have to now ask ourselves from an investigative analysis.
I disagree because I don't know that Kohberger knew about her new car, a Range Rover.
Okay.
That was new, and it's a used vehicle.
She was living there. At this point,
What,
Kaylee
Howard?
is not even really. At this point, Kaylee is not really living in the house. She's living in Coeur d'Alene. She just comes in for that weekend, and he didn't know that. He didn't expect it. And when he's circling the house, I believe, he's not really doing that night 3 times. He comes and goes. I believe he's not doing surveillance. I believe he's trying to find the will inside himself to turn off the motor, to stop the car, to climb down the hill, and to commit this crime. Each time he circles the house, it's not to see what's going on. He doesn't even really notice the cars, but it's really an internal battle he's fighting. If he had seen the cars, if he'd even seen the DoorDash delivery, there was a DoorDash delivery at 4 a.m., he might have reconsidered it. He was locked in.
Yeah, hold on, everybody. Hold on. Howard Blum, you were taking our program down a pig path Now, I guess you joining us from Manhattan that you have never been down a pig path. But what a pig path is certainly not a direct line or goes in any organized manner. It just goes all over the place. But you know what, Howard Blum? That's the way an investigation is. When I would sit around a table talking with investigators and witnesses, other DAs, one topic leads to another topic, leads to another topic. And it's hard to marshal your evidence, which you did a great job in your book doing. But guys, he brought up another thing. Blum brought up that Kohberger circles the house 3 times. And yes, I'm going to get to that store clerk who, in my mind, helped crack this case, who you say wants to remain anonymous, and I don't blame her. Long story short, how did you confirm, Howard Blum, that a white Elantra or car similar to a white Elantra circled the King Road address 3 times leading up to the quadruple murder? How did you confirm that?
Well, part of it is in court documents and the public affidavits, but I also spoke with the gas station attendant who gave the surveillance video to the police too. So a lot of that is public record. What is not public record, clearly, is what was in the driver's mind at that time as he was circling. Something you have to remember, in all the surveillance videos, there's not one photograph of the license plate of the car. There's not one photograph of the driver. You can't see who it is holding the steering wheel. The FBI has tried everything to try to pull a picture from inside the car of who was driving that night, and they couldn't. So, but Kohberger, I believe, was the man in that Hyundai Elantra, and he was trying to find the will to cross over into the man who was thinking about this horrific crime to becoming the sort of man who could commit it. And it was a difficult, difficult journey he was taking internally that night.
Families of the slain Idaho 4 victims await justice as a judge sets a date for trial.
Yeah, and that judge, many argue, is kowtowing to the defense. When are these families going to get justice? That's a whole nother can of worms. With me, Howard Blum, the author of an incredible new book, When the Night Comes Falling, a requiem for the Idaho student murders. Okay, all hands on deck to analyze what Howard Blum is telling us. Now, Howard Blum, you crossed over into the gas station video, which is later, when I believe Kohberger's leaving the scene. I'm going to go back to you stating in your book that you believe Kohberger, a white Elantra, circles the crime scene 3 times that we know of before the murders occur. Now, not the gas station video. You are telling me that's caught on video. Is it, as you describe at the end, near the end of chapter 20, a guy who owns a rental complex, I think 3 apartments, a rental complex nearby, and he's got a camera on top of the rental complex looking down? Did his video catch the Elantra circling 3 times before the murders?
Yes, and in this video too, they still can't make out a license plate. They still can't make out in the darkness the driver, but they are able to make out the car. When the FBI in Quantico is trying to figure out from these videos what kind of car it is, they try 3 different times until they finally come up with a Hyundai Elantra from 2011 to 2015. At first, they thought it was just 2011 to 2013. And that's one of the reasons why Bryan Kohberger takes so long to find him, because the authorities in Washington State were really looking for the wrong car.
Hey, just got Morgan, and everybody jump in. I'm going to circle back to you, Brian Stewart, about mens rea, about intent. Is it even needed? Do we need explicit intent, or is it implicit by the number of the killings that we have murder ones, of course we do. But I want to talk to you about the legal theory. Before that, Joe Scott Morgan, you hear Howard Blum describing 3 times he's circled that we know of. And it's caught, I believe, on the top of that rental facility. There's a camera up on the roof. And I looked everywhere when I was out there, Joe Scott Morgan. I went very slowly, and it was slippery and icy. And I fell more than once. I looked all the way up and down the street for surveillance videos. It's very narrow. I've told you this story. I could stand on one side of the street, look into the kitchen window across the street, and tell you what kind of liquid soap they had sitting on their sink at the kitchen window. It's that close. I did not see the overhead surveillance camera on that rental. It's on the roof. It's incredible. Now, he was talking about the FBI tried everything to enhance the tag and the driver. How? What did they do to enhance?
They're washing this thing through various programs that they have, Nancy, in order to try to tighten down the image, because I'm sure that it's very granulated, particularly given the nighttime status of this, where you're not going to be able to pick up, without some kind of light enhancement, like an infrared or something like this, that'll be able to give you finer detail. So it's going to be greatly compromised. And look, you have to think about the house itself. This house is kind of shaded in darkness from the rear. You're not going to see a lot there. There's not a lot. It's not like being in a huge city where you've got street lights that are all over the place that'll be illuminating this environment. So it's going to be a tough ask if you're thinking about attempting to get an image that's capturable, so that they can do what they need to do in order to identify this individual.
Okay, Joe Scott, just please stop. You know what?
Yep.
I can see a tiny little crater on the moon, but I can't get the tag number or the visage of Kohberger's face. Why?
Because these houses don't have the Hubble telescope on them. These
Nobody likes a smart aleck or a know-it-all, Joe Scott.
Well,
You're
these
right.
cameras,
You're right.
the cameras that you're talking about, they're not the highest of quality. I mean, look how many are turned out every single day. They're in shops all over the place. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a great quality.
Did Bryan Kohberger's parents suspect their son? An explosive new book suggests family knew more than they ever let on about their troubled son. Author Howard Blum tells us more.
His book is so chock full of evidence and facts supporting what many of us have been thinking and pondering, and so much more. When the Night Comes Falling by Howard Blum. Howard, we were just talking to Joe Scott Morgan about why the FBI could not enhance that video better than it did. I get it, but I heard you saying something in the background. What was that?
Well, not only couldn't they enhance the video, the FBI has this program that they developed really for anti-terrorism activities. And they tried 3 different times to analyze the car, and they got 3 different years. Originally, the car was not a Hyundai Elantra. They made it a Nissan Sentra. And then finally, there was a 2011, and then a 2013. And then they finally, at the end, said 2011 to 2015. I can assure you, the FBI's fumblings will come up in court. I'm sure the defense will raise this and try to impugn the identification of the car.
Okay, wait a minute. The FBI fumbling? I don't see them fumbling here. What do you mean by that?
Well, fumbling in the sense that their technology was just not up to snuff, and they gave declarations. The first original be on the lookout notice was not for a 2015 Hyundai Elantra. It was for a 2011 Hyundai Elantra.
Okay, hold on, Howard Blum. Hold on, Howard Blum. You mentioned a detail, and I'm not sure if you thought I was just going to ignore it or didn't catch it, but you said the FBI was trying to enhance. They tried it 3 times, I believe you said, But are you referring to the type of video surveillance that was ultimately introduced in the Kyle Rittenhouse case, where we had satellite surveillance from nearly 9,000 feet in the air to figure out what really happened? And there was video. Did the FBI go to the extent of grabbing sat video?
This was much more rudimentary. What they had was the surveillance photographs, and they tried to enhance it. These were grainy photographs, and they thought they run them through this machine, this process, this computer program that was developed at vast expense by the Department of Defense and Homeland Security originally for terrorism activities, and they thought they could get the identity of the car. And then they passed it out in their original Be on the Lookout that the Moscow police sent nationwide for a 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra. That was a mistake. That wasn't the year of the car they ultimately decided was Kohberger's.
Guys, we are speaking to an all-star panel, including author Howard Blum, who has just finished his book, When the Night Comes Falling, A Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders. To my panel, I want to thank you for kindly agreeing to join us again tomorrow night, because we've barely scratched the surface of the evidence, how it was accumulated, and what does it mean with Howard Blum. For instance, have we found a receipt for the outfit Bryan Kohberger purchased and wore during the murders? There's so much more. Please join us tomorrow night with the same all-star panel, including Howard Blum, as we, like the investigators, comb through the Kohberger evidence. But now we stop and we remember an American hero. American hero, Reserve Corporal Joseph Johnson, Nyssa, Oregon Police Department. Corporal Johnson shot and killed in the line of duty. He is survived by a grieving wife and 2 beautiful children. American hero, Corporal Joseph Johnson. Thank you to our guests for being with us tonight and illuminating the mysterious facts surrounding a quadruple murder of 4 beautiful students. Thank you for joining us, and to our MSM family as we search for the truth that will hopefully result in a true verdict. Nancy Grace signing off. I'll see you tomorrow night, 6 and 9 o'clock sharp Eastern, and until then, good night, friend. Please join us on our mission to find missing people, especially children, to solve unsolved homicides. If you're on the go, catch us on your favorite podcast app, where you can get all of our content, where we, in our own way, seek justice. Breaking news tonight, Bryan Kohberger's trial date is set. This, as the state is amassing cell and video proof. Good evening. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Crime Stories. Thank you for being with us.
Bombshell. The Kohberger trial date set after endless delays. Will the Idaho 4 victims finally get justice?
We now know the trial date is not to occur for another year. Is this really happening? Joining me, an all-star panel to make sense of what we know right now. First of all, straight out to Chris McDonough joining us, Director, Cold Case Foundation, homicide detective, and host of the YouTube channel, The Interview Room. The families of the victims very distraught at another year delay, seemingly no justice. And you know, Chris McDonough, from having been a star witness in so many murder cases, the defense's best friend is delay, delay, delay. And that is a trial strategy to delay. Agree or disagree?
100% agree, Nancy. And this is, what the family was waiting for to get a trial date. But, to be 30 months out from the moment their child is taken off of this earth is very difficult to navigate through. And it does benefit the defense.
Another thing, I'm going to circle back to the trial date, but a big blow up amongst legal eagles across the country is the body language in the courtroom. Take a listen.
Integral to Bryan Kohberger's defense is the appearance that his counsel truly believes he is innocent. Ann Taylor and her assistants have said that they support Kohberger, but body language experts say Taylor's positioning far away from Kohberger suggests otherwise. Some even say it looks like Taylor fears Kohberger. However, their attorney-client relationship shows improvement, with Kohberger breaking his usual stare during conversation with Taylor to crack a smile.
We've seen throughout history, and I'm going to go to Brian C. Stewart, a high-profile lawyer joining us out of this jurisdiction of Idaho. He is managing partner, Parker and McConkel. Question to you, Brian. We have watched the body language in the courtroom from the get-go. And let me show you a few shots just off the top of my head. For instance, there they are on earlier court dates when they were still sitting together. That's one of the first court dates ever. The courtroom body language, Brian Stewart, is conveyed to a jury. It's nonverbal, but it's very clear. And we see Ann Taylor in the Kohberger case inching further and further and further away from Kohberger. Gee, I wonder why. Weigh in.
Well, there's no question that the proximity and relationship that a defense attorney exhibits towards their client gives the perception of what that defense attorney actually believes about the client, whether or not they're dangerous or safe or guilty or innocent. And even setting the defense lawyer's actual beliefs aside, a seasoned defense lawyer is going to know that that perception is always on trial, even in motion hearings as well as at trial, that they're always being observed and always sending a message of how they feel about their client.
Joining us right now, special guest Tracy Brown, body language expert, author of How to Detect Lies, Fraud, and Identity Theft. And you can find her at bodylanguagetrainer.com. Tracy, it's great to have you. I wanted you to see the various photos and see Kohberger with his lawyer. Tracy, I was looking actually at Kohberger's outfits in court, and I was comparing one suit to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, and I noticed he always wore the same tie. And as I was looking at that, does his demeanor change? Does his strut into the courtroom change? Because I will never forget Scott Peterson. Every day he would walk into the courtroom all puffed up like this, very cocky, like a star football player, and literally strut over to the defense table. And I didn't think that was a good look for the jury. But I've been watching Kohberger's gait, his demeanor, who he looks for in the courtroom. Where does he look first? How does he seat himself? Where does he seat himself? Is he relaxed? Is he smiling? There's a lot of creepy grins going on. But then I began to notice, Tracy, the distance. Now, I guarantee you after tonight it won't happen again, but there has been a growing distance and frigidity between his defense attorney and him. And I'd like you, having studied his demeanor and his movements in court, to give us your assessment.
Well, what I see is when he walks in, he's super stiff. So either he hasn't been moving, like while he's in jail, which is possible, or it's maybe a subset of fear running through his body, which that would be a reasonable thing to think. Now, as the distance grows, right, that says emotional separation. And they definitely do not have a close relationship, him and his lawyer. Now, here's what I noticed that was really interesting in some of the video that your team sent me is when they left the courtroom, the team he left and he got out of there, and the rest of the team was still back at the table, and that tells me that he has not necessarily accepted his lawyer as the unconscious leader of the group, because if that was the case, they would rise and he would wait for them and they would leave together. So that really struck me as interesting. They are not a tight unit team at all.
I can tell you right now, this guy is never going to be allowed on the stand. Joining me, in addition to the all-star panel you've already met, Howard Blum is with us, renowned author and author of a brand new book, which is amazing. I've read the entire thing cover to cover. When the Night Comes Falling, a requiem for the Idaho student murders. You can find him at Howard Blum, that's BLUM.com. Howard, you have researched this so diligently. I want to hear your thoughts.
Well, he seems to live in his own detachment, his own little world. Even in the courtroom, it almost looks, as he stares straight ahead, it looks as if he might have been drugged beforehand to keep him under control. But you mentioned that he wears different suits. I wonder, where is he getting these suits? We know the state is paying for his defense, but where is he getting all these new suits? He seems to be going out almost posing as an actor in this. His hair is suddenly gelled. He's looking good. I think he's on some level enjoying this attention, because I also believe in the back of his mind, he thinks he's going to outsmart everyone. And he's just sort of sitting back there. I think the idea that his hands are steepled, showing confidence, I think he's really confident. I think he thinks he's going to have the last laugh.
Guys, we have been told, according to sources, he is using 5 different suits for court. Many of them look very similar. To Joseph Scott Morgan joining me, professor of forensics, Jacksonville State University, author of Blood Beneath My Feet on Amazon, and star of a hit new series, podcast, Body Bags with Joe Scott Morgan. All of that is well and good, but here's the thing about Morgan. He has investigated over 1,000 death scenes. Now, I've tried a lot of homicides. I've been to a lot of autopsies, but that is a big number, rivaled by Chris McDonough, former homicide detective. But Joe Scott, I want to talk to you about this aspect of the trial. You've been in a lot of trials. You have a real way of communicating. When I look at Kohberger, there's only one word I can think of: frigid. When he sits in the courtroom, he might as well be a stalactite sitting there in the chair next to his lawyer, who frankly looks terrified of him. She hardly even looks at him, number one. And that's the thing. That is a thing. You know, Joe Scott, when you don't like somebody or you don't like what they're saying, you know, look away like that, or you won't look in their face. People can't meet your eyes all the time when they're lying. I don't see them having any of those moments where they turn to each other and speak closely. How do you equate? Now, this may be a little out of your usual sphere that you talk about with me, because we were usually talking about body parts and blood spatter and autopsies. But I want you to compare the ferocity of those attacks on those 4 students with what we're seeing in the courtroom.
He has this cold affect, which I think that has been stated pretty clearly here. I was transfixed by what Tracy was saying a moment ago, and I've experienced this on scenes, and particularly talking with people that have this kind of absence, if you will, in the face of some of the most gruesome things that I think that are incomprehensible to most people. And I've seen this in in plain view of me, because I would come away thinking, how in the world did they not react to what I had just stated to them when you try to describe these horrible events and the aftermath here? And he's staring down this, Nancy, uh, what is it, June of 2025. He's got all of his time again to think about this. And the idea here is that he is cold and calculating, at least on the surface, it would appear. That scene that those
But how can
investigators
those two
walked
things
into.
exist, Joe Scott?
Well,
The
yeah,
ferocity, the
yeah.
vicious nature of the attacks, and the lying. I'm here to help you, he said to one of the victims before he killed them. And now this cold, austere demeanor in court.
Well, it goes to psychopathy, I think, Nancy. This idea that there is something much deeper that is going on within him. Because I got to tell you, Nancy, when I begin to think about the scene and what we have, at minimum, what we've been told at this point, there was some degree of planning that went on, and we can get into all of that. But you think about the purchase of a weapon, you think about maybe covering himself, maybe covering the interior of the car as a barrier. This goes to a broader construct. If you're prepared enough to plan, to show up and do this kind of devastation, then wouldn't it stand to reason that by extension, you're not going to abandon that position? And only somebody that is really cold-hearted could do that.
Integral to Bryan Kohberger's defense is the appearance that his counsel truly believes he is innocent. But body language experts say Taylor's positioning far away from Kohberger suggests otherwise.
The Kohberger attorney seemingly terrified of suspected Idaho students killer.
Not just evidence that is being amassed right now. We keep hearing the defense complain, I don't have the evidence. It could be much as in the case of Alex Murdaugh. Remember the car satellite evidence, the black box, so to speak? That evidence was being amassed leading all the way up to trial. And therefore, it was newly discovered. Is the state amassing cell phone and video data? Much as we saw in the case of Fotis Dulos, who was charged in the murder of his wife, Connecticut missing mom of 5, Jennifer Dulos. That said, what about evidence that's missing? And how is the state going to counter, first of all, this?
One of the items in Kohberger's apartment sparks significant interest from authorities. A Dickies clothing tag is found lying on a Walmart receipt. The receipt indicates that Kohberger purchased a dark blue work uniform that cannot be located. If Kohberger wore the long-sleeve jumpsuit during the attack and changed before driving back to Pullman, it would explain why no traces of blood were found in the white Hyundai Elantra. Investigators believe Kohberger then disposed of both the uniform and the knife used in the attack.
And not just that missing work suit, but also this. Listen.
Investigators have receipts proving that Kohberger purchases both a K-Bar knife and Dickie's work uniform, but neither item has been recovered. The morning after the murders, Kohberger drives 45 minutes south to Clarkston, Washington, situated between the Snake and Clearwater River. Kohberger makes a quick stop inside an Albertsons grocery store, and his white Elantra is seen passing Kate's Cup of Joe. Many have theorized that Kohberger disposed of the incriminating items during this trip, throwing them in the winding rivers that span more than 1,100 miles.
Okay, everybody, we got to circle back to bodies of water that we just heard our friend Dave Mack from crimeonline.com. The white Elantra is seen passing Kate's Cup of Joe. We know his route based on cell phone data. Right now, our authorities furiously combing bodies of water to find A, the murder weapon, and B, that Dickies uniform. Straight out to Howard Blum, author of When the Night Comes Falling, an amazing book full of intense research on Kohberger. What do you make first of all, about this Dickies uniform. I mean, the evidence is pretty strong in that he buys this uniform prior to the murders. Why? That's not what he wears to work. Why does he need that? What happened to it? And a clothing tag. The tag is found lying on the Walmart receipt. So we know he bought it. Where is it?
Exactly. I mean, this shows his planning, and he did not go into this just on a spur of the moment. This was a preconceived, deliberately planned event, and that also goes back to what you were talking about earlier about his confidence in the courtroom. He still believes that he's going to outsmart everyone. You can't find the murder weapon. You can't find the Dickies outfit. All this is part of his plan that allows him to think he's going to get away with it.
You know, Tracy Brown joining me, high-profile body language expert. I just want to point one thing out. I've got Jackie here in the studio going, why did he cut the tag out? Okay, I have to cut the tag out of every single thing my son wears because it scratches the back of his neck. That said, it could also be the tag off of the clothing. Like, okay, this is Walmart. You'll have not only a receipt, but there'll be a tag on, say, the sleeve. It could be that tag. That said, this is what I want to talk to you about, Tracy. The fact that the tag, this is so Kohberger, the tag from the clothing is laid neatly on top of the receipt. Who does that? I mean, who keeps those things together? I find that very, very unusual. But it goes to what Blum was just saying, the author of the new book, about the methodical psychopathy of Bryan Kohberger.
Well, this is the only way he can feel emotion in his life, right? This is his moment. This is his Olympics. He has planned and planned and planned, and he is going to make sure every detail is just right. Because remember, his amygdala probably not working, and he can't do feelings. And he's trying as hard as he can to feel something. And it's all this planning that is his moment to try to get something out of life for him.
You know
And
what's
so this is what we
interesting
get.
also, following up on Tracy, to Brian Stewart, high-profile lawyer in that jurisdiction of Idaho. Brian, have you ever had a client, and I'm just immediately thinking of Robert Blake and all of his henchmen. They actually made out a list, lie, tarp. They wrote the list, the murder list, lie, tarp, let's see, shovel. I can't even remember what all they had on their list that they needed to get rid of Bonnie Lee Bakley's body. But have you ever had a client plan so much that the planning became the proof? The lists, the receipt, the tag, the Amazon order for the K-bar knife, the Dickies uniform, just everything, turning the phone off ahead of time, then turning it back on en route home. It's just so much planning, and the trail becomes the trail to get rid of the evidence becomes the evidence.
Absolutely. I've never experienced that personally with a client, but when you see someone planning that systematically to avoid getting caught, that can become evidence that they did do it. When there's all this evidence, like the knife and the work uniform that were purchased but now have disappeared, and it's it is troubling, and he should be worried about it.
To Joe Scott Morgan, you and I have talked about this fixed blade knife many, many times. We have the Amazon order for the knife and the sheath. We found the sheath under one of the victim's dead bodies, but the knife, of all things, goes missing. Even my son and daughter, my son got a Scout knife years ago. I can tell you right now where that thing is. Why would you buy a K-bar knife that matches the sheath under the victim's body, and now the knife is... Oh, I knew you were going to do that. Thank you. Go ahead, and now the knife's gone.
Yeah. Hey, let's talk about the Dickies real quick, because that's key here, I think, Nancy. What if Liz and the crew could put that image back up of the Dickies coveralls? What's it missing that you would see on a normal pair of trousers. There are no belt loops there. Okay. Now, granted, it has pockets, but with K-bar, it has got a significant place here to run your belt through and to hang off of your pants. And I'm thinking, I've always kind of envisioned this, going into that room. It's almost like a drama that's being played out. When he withdraws that knife from the sheath, it's very dramatic, I think, for him at that moment in time. And in this fury, in this confused state, chaos, he's dropped this sheath. He doesn't have it secured to his side like you would normally think. I mean, hell, these things are made for the Marine Corps, Nancy. They have all kinds of places that they attach these things to their equipment, and in order to secure it. He failed in that one area, Nancy, and it's always been fascinating to me. And the fact that there's nothing in the car as well. He's thought about the dickies, perhaps, to cover himself. And, there's been all kinds of theories put forward about, well, why is there no evidence in the car? Did he go to the extent as well of using trash bags or plastic or something contained? Because I just knew, I would have bet you dollars to donuts that when they got that car, it was going to be a rolling crime scene, that they were going to find some evidence in there, because I've worked cases involving sharp force injuries, Nancy, and they are by far, even compared to shotgun wounds, by far the most bloody scenes that you can possibly work as a death investigator. And I cannot get past the thought that there was not an element of biological evidence left within that car. And we haven't even talked about shoes. What happened to the shoes as well, because he would have had blood on the shoes.
Welcome back, everybody. Straight to Joe Scott Morgan. What do you mean? We haven't even gotten to the shoes. But hey, hold the thought. I got to tell you something very quickly. You just said, did he put things in a trash bag? How did he keep everything? How did he keep the car pristine? I'll tell you how. Joe Scott, you probably hear this before you fall asleep at night. Me saying, when you don't know a horse, look at his track record. If you don't know what he's going to do, look at what he's done. Howard Blum, remember when Kohberger was arrested in the family home near the Poconos? What was he doing? He was standing there either in shorts or underwear with plastic gloves on at 3 in the morning?
Sorting his trash.
He was in 2 separate plastic bags. Right, Howard?
And exactly. And this shows the planning, the methodicalness that went into this. He thought he was going to be the criminology student who would outsmart the police. He thought, even when he was in Pennsylvania, he still could get away with it. He would still be able to return to Washington State University and begin teaching once again. And I think even now when he's in court, he still thinks he's going to have the last laugh. He thinks he's going to beat this case.
Hey, Chris McDonough, Director, Cold Case Foundation, jump in. I think I heard you.
But, Nancy, let's go back to the clothing for a second, and let's just talk about the removal of the tag. And whatever, if it's the tag that's attached to the dickie, then there is a number on that tag, and it's called an RN number. And that number can be traced through the Federal Trade Commission as to where that item was purchased, where that item was made, what country, et cetera, et cetera. So if he had thought through this, this methodical, and if he was smart enough to cut that tag off, if the authorities ever found that tag, they could connect it to that item. But if they found the item without the tag, they may not be able to connect it back to him. I've had a case where I actually found the mall where an item was purchased. It was a jacket in a homicide that I had, and it was directly because of that RN number.
Hold everything. Joe Scott Morgan, what he is saying leads me to my next topic, and I don't want to forget this. Yeah. What is the state doing? Because we keep hearing the defense say, you're not giving me the evidence, you're not giving me the evidence, because there's still amassing the evidence. And I was thinking more along the lines of cell phone data, of video data that they could get. Like we keep talking about the white Elantras spotted here and there. And I think they're piecing together a montage of where the Elantra was that night. But what McDonough just said about that tag, and we were earlier talking to Tracy Brown about his behavior, his stoic, severe, and methodical behavior in court. Who folds up the receipt and puts the tag from the clothes and leaves it on top of the receipt, and there it remains. But McDonough's saying you get that tag, that could be traced back to a lot, L-O-T, a lot. The exact factory that made them, where they were sent, what area of the country. He's right. Just what if, just go with me on this. What if we could trace back to that particular Walmart and catch Kohberger getting it, seeing him on surveillance video? I mean, and then what became of it? Where did it go? Just like the K-bar. Now, okay, hold that thought. And what about the shoes? You said, we haven't even gotten to the shoes. Well, I hadn't even thought about the shoes, except he may have been wearing footies.
Yeah,
it could have been surgery.
Or shoe covers. And if I could just for a second, I worked in the morgue for a long, long time, Nancy. I've participated or assisted in over 7,000 autopsies. You know what I always had on my feet? Shoe covers. And the reason you have shoe covers, and I don't want to be too graphic here, but there's a lot of blood spilled at autopsies, and it just saturates everything, super saturates everything. And the idea that he could have potentially have gone into this environment, committed this heinous crime, and from what we understand, at least at this point, it is very brutal. There will be blood evidence, if not on the bottom of his shoes, certainly on the tops. So what became of the footwear? You know, early on we heard a comment about van shoes or Vans that turned out, I don't know if they dismissed that or whatever the case was. I heard that there were people that occupied that house that had Vans. But I've always wondered about the shoes. Were they also tossed away along with gloves and this dickie and the knife in some area? Were they taken to the river and tossed in there? Or is it, or the Albertsons, which I was kind of fascinated by as well? Why not just toss it in the dumpster at a grocery store like that, where it's not going to be tracked necessarily?
Everything that I've seen to date is concerning to me because it's exculpatory. And I need to clarify this. When all of the records are produced and the dust settles and I have time to review it, I reserve the right to say, no, now I'm seeing everything. Here's what I'm seeing.
There may be a very good reason the defense has not seen all the scientific evidence yet, because the state is still amassing evidence. What is it? Will it be the nail in Kohberger's coffin for the brutal quadruple slay of 4 beautiful University of Idaho students? For instance, listen.
Since a broad gag order was enacted in the case, the public has not learned of any evidence against Bryan Kohberger outside of that listed in the probable cause affidavit. A search warrant returned from Kohberger's apartment revealed several items were seized that may prove damning for the accused killer. 8 human hairs and 1 suspected animal hair were taken from the apartment, along with cuttings from bedding with possible blood stains. Investigators also found black nitrile gloves and took a Fire TV device and computer.
Okay, Joe Scott Morgan joining me along with Howard Blum, Brian Stewart, Chris McDonough, and Tracy Brown. When we get through this, I want to go through video that Chris McDonough has made himself, going through the ins and the outs of the area. It's amazing. Everything falls into place when you can see it for yourself. I learned that out in Idaho. So Joe Scott Morgan joining us, professor of forensics, Jacksonville State University. Animal hair? Did I hear animal hair? What about the dog in the apartment? What if, just think about it. That animal hair that was seized matches back to the dog at the murder scene.
Yeah, wouldn't that be something? You begin to think about species, specifically breed. When you think about the dog that was there at the crime scene, there's a lot of people that have held that certainly, and I think our good friend Cheryl Mack has talked about, was there any contact trace evidence left for perhaps on that collar? How well was it secured at that particular time? But, you know, when you think about him, it goes back to Lecard's principle. Every contact leaves a trace. Did he contact that hair the dog is shedding? It winds up on his clothing. He goes back, or on him, on his hands, or somewhere. You never know. It could have contacted his face for all we know. Did he go back and then it was deposited at that location? All of these things have to be considered, Nancy.
Okay, what more evidence is the state amassing? Listen.
Part of the hearing on the 14th is to talk about the different parts of that video that we've received and how we need the whole context. This is the video that they say places this car near the residence. We've received little tiny pieces of that. And we think Bryan's right to a fair trial means the public needs to know that they've withheld the audio from a great portion of that, and that it starts a long time before the little clip that we've received.
The little clip that we've received. Okay, control room, could I get you to roll Chris McDonough's video, his drive-through all around the area where the crime was committed? Okay, you're seeing an incredible view here, and it goes all the way back to the gas station where the launcher was first spotted. Okay, Chris, go ahead and explain what we're seeing right now.
So what we're seeing here, Nancy, is the road that runs parallel to the residence. And you could obviously see this was taken on Thanksgiving Day. The police had still had this area secured. And then this is behind the house, looking to the neighbors to the left, which if you were looking at the back there, one area that struck me here is this window here. Underneath that window, there is a like a cinder block. You can see it right there. My initial impression was if this guy was, you know, pre-incident surveillance of this house and he had these tendencies like a peeping Tom, is he using that almost like a bench, right? To sit there, to look through the windows, those types of things. And of course, that's just a theory. We don't know that. But at the same time, I always thought this was the most logical area that this guy would make the entry into the house through that sliding glass door on the back patio.
You also have, oh, that's a really good video right there. And that is where I stood behind the house at night looking into, somebody left a light on in the home, and I could see very clearly into the home. Yep. And also the video that you amassed also of the drive-through through the area in the snow, and you went very slowly up and down all the winding streets. And I recall seeing the gas station over on the left of your video, which leads me, there you go, there we are driving beside the gas station, and then you turn left and start a circuitous wind up hills to get to the King Road address. Chris McDonough, that leads me to the car. That's where the clerk was when the car whizzed by and we got that video. Now, I believe, Chris, that there's going to be a montage of video evidence placing that Elantra all around the area. For instance, we heard that he stopped into Kate's Cup of Joe. Is he on video? Is his car on video? And I think the state is going to put together a montage of video that's not ready yet because they're still amassing it. What about it?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Nancy. There is so much work that still needs to be done, and you've been there. You stood, you know, where I stood and looked into that house, and he is. Remember, we forget that his background was to kind of teach the police about technology. So I would submit at this point, the authorities are going, okay, this guy thinks this way. So what kind of risk is he going to lower for himself to commit this crime correctly? And if you drive through the town itself, there are videos on those businesses all over the place. Evident of the fact we have the victims walking back from the bar and they're caught on video. Well, I would submit to you, he is aware of all of those pieces of potential evidence that could throw him under the bus. And the car in of itself, the Idaho Department of Transportation would have access to a lot of cameras. I know there's been some, according to some of the information that I've received, that he's not on a whole bunch of stuff, and the stuff that they're showing us today, they're pretty solid in their feeling that this is him traveling through those roads.
I guarantee you by trial time, there's going to be a video montage of Kohberger on his route, leaving the house, driving to the house, and that white Elantra is going to pop up in multiple videos. Also, that leads me to the conclusion that authorities are looking along that route right now for the murder weapon.
As Bryan Kohberger's trial approaches, Ann Taylor will do everything she can to take the death penalty off the table. Many predict that Taylor will use the same tactics cult mom Lori Vallow's team employed to escape the death penalty. In Vallow Daybell's case, prosecutors were barred from pursuing the punishment when the court found they had failed to turn over all discovery to the defense. Ann Taylor may argue that the cell phone data collected by investigators is unreliable and attack the DNA found on the knife sheath.
We know those attacks are going to happen on the evidence, but will Ann Taylor take a page out of cult mom Lori Vallow's lawyers and claim discovery wasn't handed over in time and therefore the death penalty must be taken off the table? What evidence is it that the state is amassing? Trial strategy. Straight out to Howard Blum joining us, author of When the Night Comes Falling. What do you make of what you are hearing tonight?
Well, what I've been hearing all along is that the state has been deliberately delaying things. I mean, the defense has a very good case. The state has taken way too long to amass all this evidence. You correctly point out that there is
Did you not hear anything we're saying? The state is very likely still amassing evidence as we speak. So how can they hand it over when they don't have it yet?
I disagree. How long does it take to amass all this evidence? We're talking about a year and a half on an important case, and they have all this task force working, plus the feds, and they can't get it together in time. They are dragging their heels. They're not showing the professionalism necessary to move this case forward.
Let's go forward with that. Brian C. Stewart, I know you've tried a lot of cases, but I have had cases where there actually was newly discovered evidence. And if you're talking about using satellites or amassing video from different stores, still looking for the murder weapon, still trying to triangulate cell phone data, I mean, that takes a long time. I mean, I understand people that are not familiar with the technicalities of amassing cell phone data and video data. It doesn't happen overnight, Brian.
Absolutely. And we don't know that they are still amassing more cell phone data or DNA data or surveillance data, but they said that they've turned over everything that they have to date. And even if they have done that, they'll continue to investigate and try to run down loose ends all the way until trial.
Well, bottom line, Chris McDonough, based on your drive-through that we've been showing, they have a lot of territory to cover. If they're looking for video of that Elantra, agree, disagree?
Yeah, absolutely. 100% I agree that they're looking for video of that data and they have to connect those dots back to him. So, yeah, the investigation's still fluid. It's moving.
Joe Scott Morgan, just in one last example, a data dump of all the cell phones that were in use in that area at that time. Now, we know he cut his cell phone off, but leading up to that and immediately following that, how long does that take to amass? Thousands and thousands of cell phone entries.
Doesn't take this long, and that's the big That's the big ask here. I don't understand why it has taken so long relative to the digital data and also any of the CCTV data. I'm closer to
Just Scott,
understanding
were
that
you
because they
not
might be
watching the
doing
Alex
video.
Murdaugh case? Were you and I watching two different trials when Alex Murdaugh was prosecuted for double murder? Because the state started trying day one to get the nav system data out of Alex Murdaugh's car, and they went round and round. I think it was with GM. What they went through, I mean, can you imagine taking on GM to get that data? How do I know that's not what they're looking at right now? I don't think they're dragging their feet. I think they're still working furiously.
Yeah, I'm not saying they're dragging their feet. However, I don't understand why it is taking so long. And with the Elantra, if there is a system on board in this particular model, how long does it take to process all of that data? And they might be trying to correlate it also with the cell data that they have.
Nancy?
Yeah, jump in.
Just a real quick thought to dovetail into Doc Morgan. I think there's a semantics here of necessarily understand. They have amassed the data. It's processing the data that takes all the time, and that's what the delay is. I would submit.
We wait as justice unfolds. And now we remember American hero, police officer Gonzalo Carrasco, Selma PD, California, just 24, shot and killed in the line of duty. Survived by grieving parents Gonzalo and Veronica, and his soon-to-be-born son, Gonzalo. American hero, Officer Gonzalo Carrasco, Jr. Thank you to all of our guests for being with us tonight, but especially to you joining us, as well as our new MSM family. Nancy Gray signing off. I'll see you tomorrow night, 6 and 9 o'clock sharp Eastern. And until then, good night, friend. Please join us on our mission to find missing people, especially children, to solve unsolved homicides. If you're on the go, catch us on your favorite podcast app where you can get all of our content where we, in our own way, seek justice.